the conclusion that emerges is that the moon was constructed by these survivors of some kind of apocalypse on Mars. And it probably had at least two functions initially. One was to transport a shit ton of people over here, and the other one was to act as a terraforming device. So now you put this next to what Dr. John Brandenburg discovered regarding Mars. Dr. Brandenburg, who I got to spend a few days with in New Mexico a number of years ago, he worked on the Clementine mission for NASA, and at one point he was working at Sandia Labs, which is where I think a lot of the nuclear weapons are designed. Mm-hmm. And he was looking at isotopic data from Mars. So, every planet has, certain amount of isotopes of different materials and metals and so forth on it.
Right.
And apparently the isotopic ratio of xenon-129 is consistent across the entire solar system, except for on Mars and our thermonuclear test sites on Earth. There's a deviation from the norm of the isotopic signature of xenon-129 at our thermonuclear test sites on Earth. And we find the same thing at Cydonia on Mars.
Why is it different on nuclear test sites?
There's something happens when, and it has to be not an atomic bomb, but a thermonuclear bomb. When a thermonuclear bomb is detonated, that leaves a trace of xenon-129 in that area, which is not the normal, basically, distribution of that isotope that you would find, on Earth or on any of the other rocky bodies in the solar system.
Okay.
And according to Brandenburg, it's a very distinct signature. It's unmistakable, and it's very specifically associated with thermonuclear weapons detonation. Then, after he discussed this with one of the scientists at Sandia Labs, whose expertise is working on nuclear weapons, he checked for other isotopes, and he saw that the isotopes of the isotopic ratio of thorium and uranium was also off at Cydonia in a way that matched thermonuclear test sites. And so he came to the conclusion that, and even did the math, like how many nukes would you have had to detonate in this place to produce this kind of a deviation? Turns out that an Empire State Building's worth of our highest yield thermonuclear warheads would have had to have been detonated there to produce this kind of isotopic signature. And this is exactly the same place where we find these blasted megalithic structures on the surface of Mars.
So there's a nuclear war on Mars.
So Brandenburg's thesis is that there was a nuclear war on Mars. I cover this in my book, Closer Encounters.
And did that basically get rid of the atmosphere? Is that responsible for how the atmosphere is almost non-existent on Mars?
It would definitely have been a contributing factor. I want to come around to what I think might have been another factor in that.
Okay.
But definitely would have been a contributing factor. But we were on about the moon. So why am I going on this this detour to Mars?
Yeah.
Because it's when you put Brandenburg's research next to what Joe McMoneagle saw. Mm-hmm. And by the way, while we're on this subject, Ingo Swann was also tasked, independently of Joe McMoneagle, to look at Mars twice. Once was in 1976, I think, and the other was in 1984, same year that McMoneagle did his, but Swann's team and McMoneagle were unaware of each other. These were, obviously this makes sense as protocol. They wanted two sets of remote viewers on the same target to get, corroboration. And Swann did his with a whole team of people. McMoneagle worked alone at the Monroe Institute. Swann had 5 or 6 people working with him. And in 1984, and also in the viewing in I think 76 or so, Ingo Swann and his team described exactly the same thing as Joe McMoneagle. They described a civilization on Mars, most of which was in ruins and was vastly ancient, but other parts of which still survived under the surface. He described the honeycomb of cities under the surface of Mars, and some structures on the surface, which were relaying information and being used as transportation beacons, and had been built by this civilization that is still active under the surface of Mars, cities that are subterranean. But this all came from out of discussing the moon. Mm-hmm. When you put the remote viewing data next to Brandenburg's thesis, what it suggests, and Brandenburg, his estimation was that this nuclear event in Cydonia took place maybe 100 million years ago. Maybe 100 million years ago.
Jesus.
When were the dinosaurs killed off? But
6 million?
65 million years
yeah.
ago, right? So it's a ballpark. And when you put these two sets of data together, as I did in my book, Closer Encounters, the conclusion that emerges is that the moon was constructed by these survivors of some kind of apocalypse on Mars. And it probably had at least two functions initially. One was to transport a shit ton of people over here.
The moon?
And the other one was to act as a terraforming device. So if we didn't have the moon where it is, in this extremely stable orbit that it's in, right?
Yes.
We would have 8-hour days. The Earth would be spinning much faster than it is right now. The Earth would also not be as stable as it is. There have been calculations done that show that the Earth would be prone to toppling over at odd intervals.
Well, all planets have moons, right?
Yes, but only our moon stabilizes a planet to the extent, only our moon stabilizes our planet in the way that it does, and only our moon has as stable an orbit as it does. And none of the other moons in the solar system create the beautiful eclipses that we have here, because the moon is, get this, 1/400th the size of the sun.
Yep.
And it's 1/400th the distance to the sun. So the fact that it's 1/400th the size of the sun and 1/400th distance to the sun produces this perfect eclipse.
If you put the moon directly between us and the sun, it perfectly occludes the diameter of the sun.
Exactly.
Do we know if there's any other moons?
No, there's
like
no
that?
other moon that
There's
produces
no
it.
other moons like
None.
that.
But what's even more significant is that our moon has an extremely stable orbit. No other moon in the solar system orbits its planet with as little deviation as our moon does. Yes. And so it appears there's something inside the moon stabilizing that orbit, which is also stabilizing the Earth. And what did it give us? It gave us a climate, an environment, a biosphere that rendered this planet habitable for humans. Remember what McMoneagle said. He said they sent a scout ship to another planet. It was overgrown with vegetation. It wasn't arid like Mars. There were volcanoes going off. There were electrical storms. And they were like, this place is too volatile. We can't settle here the way that it is now. So the moon was probably used in order to terraform the Earth into a habitat that Martians could settle in to become the human race. So now, there are other pieces of data.
We're talking about roughly how long ago? 100 million?
100 to 65 million years ago. Now look, the dinosaurs would probably have had to have been killed off for this, right? So one, hypothesis that follows from this is that the impact that killed off the dinosaurs was deliberate, not, some accidental asteroid impact. It wouldn't have been very easy to coexist with them, right?
Right.
Okay, but look, there are other data points that really nail this case.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the craters on the moon.
Mm-hmm.
On Earth, when you have impact craters from meteorites, for example, right? The craters are roughly proportionally deep as they are wide. They dig into the Earth. On the moon, you have these utterly bizarre craters, which are like over 100 miles wide, like the Gagarin crater or the Clavius crater. You could fit Switzerland and Luxembourg together inside some of these craters. They're over 100 miles wide. They're never more than 4 or 5 miles deep. That doesn't make any sense. The inside of these crater basins are all convex, like the surface of a contact lens.
Right.
So think about this. Why would a meteorite impact, produce a crater that's so much wider than it is deep, and then in the especially wide craters like Clavius, you see that the surface of that crater is convex? It's because it's hitting a hard shell that's underneath the regolith, and the regolith is like astroturf that's been put on the surface of that space station to make it look like it's a moon.